He was a man who was born into a world of unimaginable suffering, a world where his family was torn apart by war, where his brothers were taken from him, where he was forced to survive on the streets, a world where the brutality of the state was a constant presence. He was a man who was a nobody, a man who was a small cog in a vast and terrifying machine, a man who was trained to be a killer, a man who was sent to spy on his own people, a man who was trusted with nothing and who trusted no one. And then, in a moment that defied all logic and all expectation, he was handed the keys to the largest country on Earth, a nuclear superpower that was on the verge of collapse. He was a man who was not supposed to be there, a man who was a placeholder, a man who was a compromise candidate, a man who was expected to fail. But he did not fail. He took a broken, humiliated nation and he rebuilt it in his own image. He made it strong again. He made it feared again. He made it his. This is the story of Vladimir Putin, a man who is perhaps the most powerful and the most enigmatic leader in the world today. But here is what most people do not realize about Vladimir Putin. The man who is portrayed as a cold, calculating autocrat, the man who is feared by his enemies and admired by his followers, is a man who was shaped by a deep and abiding sense of vulnerability, a man who watched his country collapse into chaos, a man who was determined to never let that happen again, a man who was driven by a vision of Russian greatness that is both a source of strength and a source of danger. He is a man who is a master of disguise, a man who has created a persona that is both a weapon and a shield. He is a man who is not just a politician. He is a man who is a survivor, a man who is a product of his history, and a man whose actions will shape the future of the world. To understand Vladimir Putin, you have to go back to the beginning, to the bombed-out ruins of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg, a city that had been besieged by the Nazis during the Second World War, a city that had been starved and shelled into submission, a city that was still scarred by the trauma of that brutal conflict. He was born on October 7, 1952, into a world of poverty and hardship. His father, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, was a factory worker and a veteran of the Soviet Navy, a man who had been wounded in the war and who had lost two of his brothers in the conflict. His mother, Maria Ivanovna, was a factory worker and a woman of immense resilience, a woman who had nearly died during the siege and who was determined to protect her son from the dangers of the world. Putin was their only surviving child. He was a boy who was born into a world of scarcity, a world where food was rationed and where the state was the only source of security. He grew up in a communal apartment, a cramped and crowded space where multiple families shared a single kitchen and a single bathroom. It was a world where there was no privacy, where the constant presence of others was a fact of life. It was a world where he learned to be tough, to be resourceful, and to never trust anyone completely. He was a boy who was born into a world that was defined by loss, a world that was defined by the trauma of war. He was also a boy who was deeply influenced by the stories of the war, by the tales of heroism and sacrifice that were told by his parents and his neighbors. He was a boy who was raised to believe in the strength of the Soviet Union, to believe that the state was the ultimate protector, to believe that the enemies of the state were the enemies of the people. He was a boy who was deeply patriotic, a boy who dreamed of serving his country, a boy who was determined to make something of himself. He was not a good student. He was a mediocre student, a boy who was more interested in sports and in fighting than in his studies. He was a boy who was often in trouble, a boy who was known for his toughness and his willingness to stand up to bullies. He was a boy who was determined to prove that he was not weak, a boy who was determined to overcome the poverty and the limitations of his upbringing. He was a boy who was learning the lessons of the street, lessons that would serve him well in his future career. He was drawn to the martial arts, and he began to practice Sambo, a Russian form of wrestling and judo. He was a natural athlete, and he excelled in the sport. He became a master of judo, and he would later become a black belt. The discipline of martial arts gave him a sense of structure and purpose, a sense of control over his life that he had not had before. He was a young man who was learning the value of discipline, the importance of strategy, and the power of patience. He was a young man who was determined to make his mark on the world. He joined the Communist Party, and he began to pursue a career in the KGB, the Soviet intelligence agency. It was a decision that would define his life. The KGB was the most powerful institution in the Soviet Union, an organization that was feared by its enemies and by its own citizens. It was an organization that was built on secrecy, on loyalty, and on the ruthless pursuit of power. He was a young man who was drawn to the power and the prestige of the KGB, a young man who believed that serving the state was the highest calling. He was recruited by the KGB after he graduated from law school at Leningrad State University in 1975. He was a young man who was now part of the system, a young man who was being trained to be a spy. He served in the KGB for 16 years, rising through the ranks and becoming a lieutenant colonel. He was a man who was deeply committed to his work, a man who believed in the mission of the KGB, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to protect the security of the Soviet Union. He was stationed in Dresden, East Germany, during the final years of the Cold War. It was a posting that was both dangerous and humiliating. East Germany was a satellite state that was on the verge of collapse, and the KGB officers stationed there were forced to watch as the Soviet Empire crumbled around them. He was a man who was witnessing the collapse of everything he believed in, a man who was seeing the world that he had dedicated his life to defend crumble into dust. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union began to dissolve. Putin returned to Leningrad, now known as St. Trauf, Petersburg, a city that was in chaos, a city that was struggling to adapt to the new realities of the post-Soviet world. He was a man who was unemployed, a man who was stripped of his identity, a man who was forced to start over. He was a man who was determined to survive, and he was a man who was determined to find a new purpose. He turned to politics, and he became an advisor to Anatoly Sobchak, the reformist mayor of St. Petersburg. He was a man who was learning the art of politics, a man who was building a network of contacts, a man who was positioning himself for the future. He was also a man who was deeply disillusioned by the chaos of the post-Soviet period. He watched as the Russian economy collapsed, as hyperinflation wiped out the savings of millions, as the oligarchs grew rich by looting the state's assets. He watched as Russia was humiliated by the West, as NATO expanded to the borders of Russia, as the country that had once been a superpower was reduced to a second-rate power. He was a man who was deeply angry, a man who was determined to restore Russian greatness, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. In 1999, Putin was appointed prime minister by President Boris Yeltsin, a man who was increasingly unpopular and increasingly incompetent. Yeltsin was looking for a successor, a man who would protect him from prosecution and who would continue his policies. He chose Putin, a man who was relatively unknown, a man who was seen as a loyal and capable administrator. Putin was a man who was not supposed to be the leader. He was a man who was a compromise candidate, a man who was expected to be a placeholder, a man who was expected to fail. But he did not fail. He was a man who was determined to succeed, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to consolidate his power. He launched a brutal and effective military campaign in Chechnya, a breakaway republic that was a hotbed of Islamic extremism. The campaign was ruthless, and it was successful. It established Putin as a strong leader, a man who was willing to use force to protect the integrity of the Russian state. He was a man who was restoring the authority of the central government, a man who was showing that Russia was not weak. In 2000, Yeltsin resigned and Putin was elected president. He was a man who had achieved the highest office in the land, a man who was now the leader of the largest country on earth. He was a man who was determined to rebuild Russia, a man who was determined to make Russia strong again. He began to centralize power, to bring the regional governors under his control, and to suppress the independent media. He used his control over the state television networks to shape public opinion, and he used the law to crush his political opponents. He also began to cultivate a new class of oligarchs, men who were loyal to him and who would support his policies. He was a man who was building a new system, a system that was based on loyalty and patronage, a system that was designed to ensure his control over the country. He was a man who was determined to never again allow Russia to descend into chaos. He also began to reassert Russian power on the international stage. He challenged the dominance of the United States, and he sought to restore Russia's influence over its neighbors. He invaded Georgia in 2008, and he annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. He was a man who was demonstrating that Russia was a force to be reckoned with, a man who was not afraid to challenge the West. He was also a man who was deeply distrustful of the West, a man who believed that the United States and its allies were determined to weaken and destroy Russia. He saw the expansion of NATO as a direct threat to Russian security, and he was determined to stop it. He was a man who was operating from a position of deep-seated fear and a sense of historical grievance, a man who was determined to never again be humiliated. In 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a decision that would shock the world and that would lead to a brutal and protracted war. The invasion was a gamble, a risk that was based on the assumption that the Ukrainian government would collapse and that the Russian army would be welcomed as liberators. But the gamble failed. The Ukrainian resistance was fierce, and the Russian army was met with unexpected resistance. The war has become a quagmire, a conflict that has cost tens of thousands of lives and that has isolated Russia from the international community. It has also transformed Putin's image in the West from a wily and pragmatic politician into a reckless and dangerous autocrat. He is now a man who is a pariah, a man who is the target of international sanctions, a man who is being investigated for war crimes. He is a man who is isolated, a man who is increasingly detached from reality, a man who is willing to sacrifice everything for his vision of Russian greatness. He is also a man who is deeply popular in Russia. He has cultivated a persona of strength, competence, and patriotism. He is portrayed as the savior of the nation, the man who restored Russian pride and greatness. He is a man who is seen as a father figure, a strong leader who is protecting the country from its enemies. His approval ratings are high, and his grip on power is firm. He is a man who has created a system that is designed to ensure his survival, a system that is based on loyalty, fear, and control. He is a man who is the master of his own universe, a man who is the architect of his own destiny. The legacy of Vladimir Putin is still being written. He is a man who has achieved a great deal, but he is also a man who has caused immense suffering. He is a man who has restored Russian pride, but he has also isolated Russia from the world. He is a man who is a master of strategy, but he has also made catastrophic miscalculations. He is a man who is a product of his history, a man who is shaped by the trauma of the Soviet collapse, a man who is determined to never allow Russia to be weak again. He is a man who is both a hero and a villain, a man who is admired by some and reviled by others. He is a man whose story is a reflection of the contradictions of the modern world, a world that is defined by the struggle between order and chaos, between power and morality, between the past and the future. Why should someone born today still care about Vladimir Putin? Because his life is a testament to the power of ambition and the importance of resilience. He was a man who was born into poverty, a man who was a nobody, a man who was not supposed to succeed, but he overcame every obstacle and he achieved greatness. He showed us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He showed us that the pursuit of power is a noble endeavor, but it must always be tempered by wisdom and restraint. He showed us that the most powerful force in the world is not violence, but the will to succeed. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the power we wield, but the legacy we leave behind. But his story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of humility. He is a man who was driven by a vision of greatness, a vision that was both inspiring and dangerous. He is a man who was unable to see his own flaws, a man who was unwilling to compromise, a man who was ultimately isolated by his own success. He showed us that the most important thing is not the power we wield, but the wisdom we show. He taught us that the pursuit of justice is a noble endeavor, and that it is never too late to change the world. He showed us that even in the darkest hour, hope is possible, and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and his story will continue to be told for generations to come. He was a man who once said, "The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century." He was a man who was still mourning the loss of the empire, a man who was determined to restore Russian greatness. He was a man who was operating from a position of deep-seated grievance, a man who was determined to never again be humiliated. He was a man who showed us that the most important thing is not the success we achieve, but the difference we make in the world. He was a man who showed us that the pursuit of excellence is a noble endeavor and that it is never too late to change the world. He was a man who was not just a politician. He was a man who was a symbol, a man who was a legend, a man whose story will continue to inspire and to terrify generations to come. He was a man who taught us that the most important thing is not the obstacles we face, but the way we respond to them. He was a man who showed us that, even in the darkest hour, hope is possible and that the human spirit is indomitable. He was a man who changed the world, and he will never be forgotten.